Okay, on this video I do want to lay down some of the fundamental economic principles that we're going to use to understand different pricing mechanisms. First of all, I want to make very clear what economic conditions have to hold for a firm to be able to price discriminate, that is, to charge different prices to different customers for the same good. And of course, the first thing is that the firm has to have some monopoly power. There has to be a downward sloping demand curve for that firm's products or services. A counterpoint that I mentioned in the last video, perfectly competitive firm is a price taker. Take it or leave it. They don't have to spend any time thinking about price strategy. If you're a corn farmer or an apple grower or a coal miner, you sell it at the market price. But most firms actually do have a downward sloping demand curve for their product, and so pricing is a real decision for them. But you've got to have that downward sloping demand curve. Two, the firms can price discriminate when they have some ability to identify which consumers should get the high price and which consumers should get the lower price. In other words, they've got to have some way of either identifying those groups of people directly or the capability of coming up with a pricing scheme that will allow those people to self-select into either the low or the high price. Now you might say self-select, what do you mean? Well, for instance, some people use coupons, religiously grab the Sunday paper and clip that thing to death, use all the coupons they get in the mail. Other people don't think it's worth their time, and so there's something different about those populations, and firms can exploit that. Another example, of course, which airlines have used for years is business versus leisure travelers, and they try to identify that based on day or time of day that people are flying. And so that helps them, even though they don't know who the price sensitive and the price insensitive customers are, they can use tricks like that to get the customers to identify themselves voluntarily. And then the third really critical assumption is that there's no chance for arbitrage across markets. Arbitrage means that if, let's imagine in the stock market, for instance, IBM stock can't be selling to one group of customers at a price of $100 and another group of customers at $99. There are people, maybe some of you in the class yourselves, who are constantly looking for little frictions in the market like that, and then would immediately start, shall we say, buy low, sell high. So those are, you've got to be able to prevent that from happening. Otherwise, the people that buy at the low price will always be able to resell to people willing to pay a higher price, and eventually that's not going to be sustainable. You're going to have to start charging the same price to everybody. So anyway, these are three essential conditions for firms to be able to price discriminate. They've got to have a downward sloping demand curve. They've got to have some way either to directly identify high price versus low price customers or get them to self-select on their own. And finally, you've got to separate the groups because otherwise somebody will start buying from the low group and selling to the high group, and that's going to blow your strategy away. Now, what are some of the fundamentals that we want to think about in terms of setting prices? Well, the first thing, and maybe let's just use airlines again as an example here. Let's think of there being a leisure market and there being a business market. Well, you want to end up setting prices in both of those markets so that marginal revenue is the same in each. And to think about that, imagine a plane full of leisure travelers on Saturday morning. Suppose that generates marginal revenue of $100,000. And then you've got a plane full of business travelers on Monday morning generating maybe $200,000 of additional revenue. why doesn't that make sense? Well, you probably ought to be looking at scheduling more Monday flights because the extra revenue kick there is greater than the Saturday morning flights. So in terms of your service rotation for planes or crew rotations, you would be thinking, all right, I want to put more resources into the high marginal revenue markets and fewer resources into the low marginal revenue markets. So for the firm to maximize its profits, it's got to be able to have marginal revenue be the same in each market segment. So that's the trick. And if it doesn't do that, that means that there's some way that it can increase total revenue by simply moving resources around, keeping marginal costs the same, but raising revenue. So marginal revenue has to be the same in each market. The other trick, of course, is once you've balanced out marginal revenue, it's got to equal marginal cost. And this just goes back, this should be pretty clear. If marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue in any of the markets, then you're producing too much and you need to cut back. If marginal revenue is above marginal cost, you're not producing enough and you need to produce more. So anyway, what you might think is, say you have two markets, marginal revenue has to be equal to each other in those two market segments, and then marginal cost has to equal those marginal revenue totals. So that's kind of the fundamental driver behind the economic models that we'll be looking at this week. Now, I want to close this video. Okay, I want to close by looking at a simple chart from a textbook that I used a year ago that I think sorts out pretty well different pricing strategies that we're going to be looking at the next videos and what situations they can be used in. And of course, some of this we've already covered. Does the firm have market power? Yes, that has to be true. Can it prevent resale and arbitrage? We just talked about that. That has to be true. Do the customers have different demand curves? We're not really going to get into that one, but we're just going to assume that they do. But then what becomes critical is, can the firm directly identify the customer's demands before they buy the product? If they can't, that forces the firm to use things like quantity discounts or a practice called versioning that we'll talk about in a later video, which is having, as you might imagine, different versions of the same product. You might look at printers, for instance, and there's a high end, the middle end, and the low end, and the price differentials between those goods. How do you set those? And of course, coupons are great. Going back to the Florida example, they give coupons to local residents to give them a 50% discount, and the coupon is not valid if you're an out-of-state person, and they might even check your ID on that. So those are all forms of second-degree price discrimination, so we'll be looking at that. Now, if you can identify the customers directly, then you can charge different prices for the same good to different people. And so then the question becomes, how much information do you have about individual customers? If you do have some information, then you can engage in something that we're going to call perfect or first degree price discrimination, where you literally try to charge a different price to every customer. The alternative, if you can't pull that off, if you can only have information on groups of customers, you will do something market segmentation, which is also called third degree price discrimination. Okay, so anyway, what we've done in this video, we've talked about what conditions have to hold for a firm to be able to charge different prices to different customers for the same or similar goods. We've talked about some basic economics. Marginal revenue in each segment has to end up being the same, and of course marginal revenue has to equal marginal cost. And then we tried to lay out a little bit more carefully the situations in which different pricing strategies can be used. All right, let's roll up our sleeves. Next stop is first degree price discrimination, charging different prices to as many people as possible.